the work that I'm going to be talking about today is work from my master's thesis, work that was done in collaboration, as Joan mentioned, with the Sea Garden Restoration Project in the Gulf Islands National Park. And Saanich and Hokuminum members lead and carry out all aspects of that work in partnership with Parks Canada. And because of this, I'd like to go beyond our acknowledgement for the gathering today on the traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, and also acknowledge the lands and communities that this project is about and connected to, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Saanich and Hokuminum. So today, I'm going to be talking about my master's work, which focuses on the management side of clam gardens, looking at barriers to Indigenous food sovereignty and pathways forward to reestablishing thriving shellfish food systems. But before we get into that, I want to spend a bit of time introducing me, my connection to clam gardens, and the work of the Sea Garden Restoration Project. So I wanted to spend some time talking about my why, about where I'm doing this work. I was born and grew up in Vancouver, and I'm of settler descent, which I'm telling you this because my settler perspective is always going to frame the story that I am sharing with you today about clam gardens. And as clam gardens are an Indigenous practice, the story I'm sharing is not mine, but it's that of Indigenous peoples on the West Coast. I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to have been a part of this work and in this space, and to learn from clam gardens and their caretakers. And it's my responsibility to share what I've learned in as honest a way as I can. So that's why I make time to discuss my positionality. So I spent a lot of time in my childhood visiting the Gulf Islands, living in Vancouver, not that far away. Main Island specifically has a soft place in my heart. Lots of childhood memories, gazing in tide pools, watching seals and other whales and stuff go by from the beach. And it was only much later that I learned that the beaches I was spending so much time on have been cared by Indigenous peoples for generations. And a lot of these beaches in the Gulf Islands are clam gardens. So, clam gardens. I thought I would start off with a bit of the sort of biophysical aspects of clam gardens. I know some of you have probably heard about clam gardens before. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So on the top here is a beach without human influence, or clam garden care practices. And this dotted line with the orange and black is the area that clams could grow in. Below is a beach that has been altered by clam garden practices. What happens often is there'll be a rock wall that's built at the low tide line, and that would cause the drainage pattern to be altered on the beach. And so over years and years, the slope of the beach will actually flatten. And that means that there's a larger piece of land within that optimal clam habitat. And so more clams can grow. And it's important to mention that the building of a rock wall isn't the only aspect that describes a clam garden. So what truly describes a clam garden, or in my understanding from the literature, but more importantly from speaking to clam garden knowledge keepers, is that beaches are considered a clam garden if they have any form of practices that are designed to increase the abundance of clams. So building a rock wall to modify the beach is one practice, but it may not be necessary for all beaches. For example, one of the beaches that I had the opportunity to visit on Saturna Island, I was participating in some of the restoration activities there. The beach didn't have any rock wall, but it was still considered a clam garden because we were actively tilling the sand sediments. Some other practices beyond that are adding shell hash or gravel, transplanting baby clams into the beach, or removing clam predators. And you can see that all of those practices enable the clam population to thrive. So I know I've talked a lot about clams here. It's also worth mentioning that clam gardens are not only about increasing the productivity of clams, but there are other species that also thrive in these environments. So we can find a lot of little neck clams, horse clams, cockles, and the like, but there's also an increase in red rock crabs, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, some seaweeds, and a few other species. And so the Wasanich Leadership Council put forward this idea that clam gardens are actually more accurately described as sea gardens, reflecting the diversity of culturally valued species that they support. So as I go on in this presentation, I'm going to be referring to them as sea gardens. So geographically, sea gardens are found from Washington to Alaska. It's a knowledge shared by multiple First Nations and tribes along that region. And temporally, Indigenous knowledge holders describe that sea gardens have been cared for since the beginning of time. From a Western science perspective, using radiocarbon dating and other techniques, we can date the age of rock walls to 3,500 years old. But it's also interesting to consider that they could be much older than that when we think about how people would have rebuilt walls in reflection of the changing sea levels and needing to remain at the low tide line, because we're talking about thousands and thousands of years here. So beyond the biophysical, geographical sort of aspects, caring for clams is a way of life, grounded in ceremony and stewardship. And because this is not my culture or my worldview, I thought it was better shared by those who live it. So Elder Philomena Williams and Jim Elliott talk about clams as a valuable resource, a staple, a source of protein always available. And once harvested, clams are traditionally prepared over a fire and sometimes dried out and strung with cedar root to form necklaces. And these necklaces play a part in trade or gifts for potlatch ceremonies. And I think the significance of all of this cultural aspects is really incorporated in this sculpture by Bill Reed on the slide there. It's called The Raven and the First Men, and it depicts the origins of humans in a clam in Haida legend. So here, sea gardens and shellfish food systems, we sort of have a system where people in nature, community, and coast are linked in a reciprocal relationship through the care practices for clams. This on the slide here is the Community Capacities Framework by Mark Rosland, and it presents 6 capitals contributing to community mobilization. So I think it's interesting to look at for communities connected to clams. Natural capital at the top there. We've got, the resources that provide goods and services. So the beaches, the water, really leading to biodiversity and an abundance of clams. Physical capital. We have these modified beaches, these cared for beaches, and economic capital, clams as a product. They are involved in trade, source of income. At the bottom here with human capital, which includes knowledge, skills, and that's really embodied in the practices that are involved for caring for these beaches. And with social capital, it's really about the interactions in the community and just thinking about how caring for these beaches brings people together and increases those interactions. And then finally, cultural capital, the values, the heritage, the traditions, and these are all embodied through ceremony and stories relating to clams and those beaches. So sea gardens and shellfish food systems here, what I'm trying to go for is they're enabling every facet of community mobilization, which just goes to show how linked community and coast are by clams. So here is a word cloud generated from video transcripts of sea gardens and working group members talking about sea gardens and the restoration they're doing. Words that are used more frequently are shown bigger. So what's interesting here is that the way people talk about clams and sea gardens reflects every aspect of that community and those connections. Clams, you know, that's associating the natural capital, the biological aspects. A beach, physical capital, a sense of place. People, that's that culture and that social aspects. And then we have words like knows and learn. And those are talking about the knowledge and the practices of that human capital, or digging, work. Those are stewardship practices linked to the human capital. And so now I just want to talk a bit about the Sea Garden Restoration Project. As I mentioned in the introduction, this work is led by Wasanich and Hulkuminum and in partnership with Parks Canada. They've been restoring sea gardens in the Gulf Islands since 2014. So we have paleoecological and archaeological records that show that even though sea gardens have not had the same level of stewardship practices over the past 200 years, the beaches remain more productive than another beach would. And that these beaches, while they are more productive than an unmanaged beach would be, because of colonization and the impacts it's had on Indigenous communities, the beaches aren't as productive as they maybe once were. But that fact of them still, even over 200 years of having lasting effects of the care that was given to those beaches, I found true when I was doing restoration work with the project on Saturna Island, and we went to go visit this beach that someone had identified as a potential sea garden we weren't yet aware of. And we went to explore the beach and see if it was a sea garden that we weren't aware of, but had been a sea garden, you know, prior to colonization. And we were finding clams everywhere, even though this beach hadn't been cared for in the same way over the past 200 years. So it's quite an amazing technology to have such a lasting impact. So the restoration in the project is carried out by 2 working groups, and these working groups are led by knowledge keepers. And these knowledge keepers are there because they can identify what care practices should be given to what beaches. Remember when I was introducing what sea gardens are, I mentioned that some sea gardens don't need a rock wall, some sea gardens need tilling or adding shell hash. And it's the value of those knowledge keepers, the contributions that they have in understanding what practices are needed for each beach. So I just want to shift here to a more biological aspect of shellfish systems. So shellfish are filter feeders, and so they're highly sensitive to the water quality in their marine environment. As they're filtering water to consume plankton, they can also accumulate contaminants in their tissues, and those contaminants can be dangerous for humans that consume them. So the first and most concerning category of contaminants is the marine biotoxins. So the marine biotoxins are sometimes called red tide. You might have heard that word before. This is actually a misnomer or misconception, because not all biotoxin producing organisms are red, and not all red organisms produce biotoxins. So marine biotoxins are naturally produced by phytoplankton in the water column. And on the slide, I've put the most relevant biotoxins. So at the top, saxitoxins cause paralytic shellfish poisoning. Domoic acid causes amnesic shellfish poisoning, and the rest cause diuretic shellfish poisoning. But it's really the paralytic and amnesic shellfish poisoning that can be fatal, and so are pretty serious. The toxins can't be detected by smell, taste, or sight, really any of your senses, and they're not destroyed in the cooking process. So that just goes to show why it's important for managing. The next category is the chemical contaminants, and these are chemicals like heavy metals, mercury as an example, or hydrocarbons like petroleum, pesticides like DDT, and an up-and-coming category which we don't know much about is the pharmaceuticals. So there was a study that found ibuprofen in clam tissues. And then the last, and before I move on, the sources of chemical contaminants are like mining, so in leaching of chemicals, or agricultural runoff. And the final categories, bacteria and viruses, you can kind of group together and call pathogens. And these, the bacteria concentrations are measured using fecal coliforms as an indicator bacteria for a lot of the other bacterias and pollution. And then, yeah, a few viruses of note, norovirus, hepatitis A. The pathogens some of them are naturally occurring, such as Vibrio, a bacteria, but most pathogens are the result of human or animal fecal matter. And so sources can usually be traced to discharge of wastewater treatment plants or sewage contamination. Boats are a key point source here, agricultural and urban runoff, or wildlife. And pivoting again, or building on that, I want to just take a quick look at the policy side of shellfish systems. So in Canada, there's 4 government departments at the federal level that are in control of ensuring that no contaminated shellfish make it to the consumer market. And this is the cornerstone of the Canadian Shellfish Sanitation Program, the CSSP, in that green box on the far right. So first at the top, we have Health Canada, and they're responsible for establishing the regulations and standards for safety of foods in Canada. Now, they're a little bit outside of the CSSP, but they set the regulations that inform everything else. What we call the first line of defense against contamination is through water quality testing. And this is run through Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, and their Shellfish Water Classification Program. So this is the program that runs the fecal coliform test that I talked about with the bacterial pollution and bacterial water quality. And they also work to identify those sources of pollution. The second line of defense is run by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA. And they're in charge of surveying the marine biotoxins, remember the ones causing the shellfish poisoning. And they kind of have the coordinating role of the CSSP because of their roles as well in licensing and regulation. But both the water quality testing, the ECCC component, and the shellfish testing, the CFIA component, are received by DFO, the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and they receive them as recommendations to open or close specific harvest sites. So DFO is the one responsible for actually enforcing those open or closes and notifying the public of changes in the status of the harvest sites. So the CSSP program, run by those government departments and supported by a few key pieces of legislation in Canada. So the Fisheries Act and a few other ones like Management of Contaminated Fisheries Regulations, Fish Inspection Acts, there's a few there. So that's a glimpse into the world of governing contamination in shellfish. But I'm going to move on. So we've gone through sea gardens and a little bit about the Indigenous aspects of shellfish food systems, as well as the colonial sort of governing perspectives. And now I'm going to move on to my project's objectives, my project's findings. So what I, in collaboration with Parks and the two working groups, wanted to do was synthesize a framework for Indigenous food sovereignty. And I'm going to go into what that is in a moment, and to describe the barriers in shellfish food systems and explore levers for moving forward. And so Indigenous food sovereignty is about the right to access healthy and culturally adapted foods. So in synthesizing a framework, I want to make it clear that Indigenous food sovereignty can mean many things to different people. And so here the objective isn't to define it, more to describe it using literature that's grounded in Indigenous perspectives. And we do this because it's enabling me to discuss the barriers in a novel way. So this framework is synthesized from two well-referenced definitions in the literature. And the inner blue circle is based on concepts presented by Don Morrison, who's the founder, chair, and coordinator of the BC Food Systems Network Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, and a member of the Secwepemc Nation in interior BC. The outer yellow circle is a paper by Jernigan et al., which is a more recent paper that looks into community health indicators. So it's broken down into 4 quadrants and paired up in that way. The self-determination quadrant has, up in the top right there, has 4 sub-elements: access to resources, production, trade, and food consumption. And these refer to the ability of a community to respond to their own needs for healthy, culturally adapted Indigenous foods, and to make decisions over the amount and quality of the food that's harvested. In the bottom right corner, the sacred or divine sovereignty and culture aspects, those both highlight the element of Indigenous food sovereignty that recognizes that food is sacred, and there's a responsibility to nurture healthy relationships with the land that provides the food. The participation and community involvement quadrant discusses how essential the inclusion of and involvement of the individuals and the families and the communities in the day-to-day actions that nurture the relationships with the land. And it also discusses the role of knowledge keepers in sharing knowledge to younger generations for maintaining traditional food practices. And then the last quadrant there on policy and legislation This is about reconciling Indigenous food and cultural values with colonial laws through policy reform. So there's 4 barriers here that I'm going to present. The first one is about harvest closures. And as I explained already, some kinds of phytoplankton produce marine biotoxins, and that makes shellfish unsafe for consumption. And the frequency of these harmful algal blooms is increasing, in part due to climate change, but that's only a small part of the problem. As I mentioned earlier, in Canada, we have the Canadian Shellfish Sanitation Program, the CSSP, and they're responsible for testing the marine biotoxin levels. So what happens is the tissues of clam will get tested on a specific beach, and if they're found to be high in unsafe levels for consumption, then the beach gets closed. The issue here is that for many beaches that are prioritized by Indigenous harvesters, these closures can remain for years or decades. And these are over timescales where the marine biotoxin levels could have changed. So we have situations where even though marine biotoxin levels on a specific beach might be safe for consumption, the beaches are still closed because there's a lack of phytoplankton monitoring and shellfish tissue testing to reassess the beach. So this is definitely a policy barrier, looking at the CSSP, which prioritizes testing for commercial harvesters and not Indigenous harvesters, leaving sites that are prioritized for Indigenous harvesters with a lack of monitoring. And that piece of legislation there doesn't ensure the access to cultural foods and resources. So it's also a barrier to self-determination production, because there's a limit of the amount of shellfish harvested when beaches are closed. And it's also a barrier to trade, because the category of food, social, and ceremonial harvesting rights is not recognized to include the sale of resources for financial benefit. And as a way forward in this barrier, we look at a case study in Alaska. So here in Alaska, not here, up there in Alaska, there's an Indigenous-led phytoplankton monitoring and shellfish testing program. Like you can see in the 2 photos, the one on the left is a phytoplankton monitoring, and the one on the right is tissue testing. And this program places the needs of Indigenous harvesters at the forefront of the monitoring design. And they also communicate the levels of contaminants directly to the communities that rely on the shellfish harvesting. So what we need here is the capacity and funding to support Indigenous-led phytoplankton monitoring and shellfish testing programs that will support the reassessment and reopening of those harvesting sites. The second barrier is about bacteria and viruses. And as I already introduced, bacteria and viruses are a separate category of contaminants to marine biotoxins. And though they contribute to the harvest closures mentioned in the last barrier, I wanted to separate them out because the ways that we're addressing them are different. So we know that high levels of these pathogens make shellfish unsafe for consumption, and that's a barrier to self-determination access to resources if we're considering safe shellfish beds as a resource. Looking at a potential way forward, I want to take a look at a case study in Puget Sound. This is the Hood Canal Pollution Identification and Correction Program. It's definitely a long name, but they do good work. So their program runs by inventorying all of the on-site sewage systems in the area, so along the Hood Canal on the right. And then they also do investigations of pollution sources and follow up with maintenance to on-site sewage systems. And with that work, they've successfully increased the water quality and reopened beaches for harvesting in the area. And this program has a few key factors that I think contribute to its success and that are important to apply to any new system that we would build over here, for example. So in addition to the pollution source investigations, they preemptively service on-site sewage systems by providing rebates for owners of these sewage systems to incentivize the maintenance actions and prevent sewage leaks before they're actually occurring. And they also coordinate across jurisdictions. So the program is a collaboration between the Washington Department of Ecology, the Department of Health, and then also with local counties and tribes. So what we need here is Indigenous-led and regionally implemented pollution identification and correction programs for the improvement of local water quality and in areas that are prioritized for Indigenous shellfish harvesting. Our third barrier that I want to talk about today is access to beaches. So this includes elements like land privatization and coastal development, like you can see on the figure on the right. It's also, though, about jurisdictional overlaps over beaches, and that only increases communities' confusion as to what their right to harvest is. For example, in the Gulf Islands, sea gardens are within the federal jurisdiction because it's a national park or park reserve. But in other areas, it might be in provincial jurisdiction. And the third part of this barrier is the transportation-related expenses. So many community members highlight how much is involved in getting to their traditional territories, their beaches. You know, it might involve gas costs for their cars or ferry. And many community members don't own boats. So this barrier is a barrier to self-determination access to resources, similarly that I mentioned before, where the shellfish beds are considered a resource. But it's also a legislation and policy barrier because the Western science concept of land ownership is grounded in colonial systems that don't align with those Indigenous values and views. And then finally, the participation in community involvement barrier is there because it's a lack of transportation options to get community members to harvest sites. So a way forward here, it could look like leveraging the mandate of colonial government agencies in supporting reconciliation. So remember, our government agencies in Canada are held to the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and in BC we have a similar act, DRIPA. So if we can leverage those mandates to prioritize access to beaches for Indigenous harvesters, then what might that look like? An easy way here is if a government agency representative has to do field work, maybe they take a community member with them. And the last barrier here is ways of life. So in Canada, we're moving towards reconciliation and being more honest and acknowledging the negative impacts of residential schools, of the 60s scoop, of the loss of culture that some of these communities are facing when their elders and knowledge keepers are passing on. And all of those are negatively impacting Indigenous ways of life. So first here, the barriers to the divine sovereignty culture kind of quadrant, because there's less opportunities for communities to engage with their culture and their traditional knowledge. And as you can see in this figure on the right, there's so many foundational parts of the culture that are lost when we're not consuming traditional foods. All of those sections, teachings to cooking, those are all not present when we're not eating the top there. And it also relates to the self-determination food consumption element because it places importance on all community members having access to cultural foods, which is not the case when there's only a few harvesters in a community. So overcoming this barrier, knowledge sharing is a key lever here, supporting cultural resurgence opportunities, spending time on the land, connecting with elders and youth. A case study here is the Eco-Cultural Sea Gardens Restoration Project, which is affiliated with the Sea Gardens Restoration Project. And they're using both traditional and modern cultural resurgence methods, such as community sea garden restoration days and more modern methods like making videos detailing traditional food practices. And so what does that mean, reconnecting? Well, based on the barriers and the potential ways moving forward, there's sort of three main management gaps and needs. So the first is ensuring that there's an organization with Indigenous representation that has the mandate and funding to support Indigenous harvesters. And building on this, the second is that we have the capacity and funding to implement those shellfish testing and pollution control programs like we see in Alaska and Washington. And the third is to prioritize opportunities for cultural resurgence in communities, allowing communities to engage with their culture. Now, exciting work is happening in this space of reconnecting community and coast through clams. One such project is led by the First Nations Health Authority in BC. They're running a pilot project. It's called We All Take Care of the Harvest, or WATCH project, which I think is such a great acronym. The WATCH project focuses on designing community-based phytoplankton monitoring programs, and they're working in 4 pilot First Nations communities along the BC coast. So the program works with each community to develop a capacity for communities to lead this monitoring work. So, for example, this work might be led by the nation's Guardian program. And then those members have a more direct link to communicating their findings to the communities, which means that oftentimes those findings get communicated to the community faster than DFO's decision to close harvesting sites. So we're already seeing pretty amazing developments in their pilot project. And I just kind of want to end the talk today by thanking the people who've been integral to this project, namely my supervisor, Richard Paisley, and my second reader, Glenn Hearns, my advisor at Parks Canada, Bryant DeRoy. And I'd also like to thank Hannah Morris from the Saanich Leadership Council, and just reiterate how the Indigenous Knowledge Working Group members from both nations, the Saanich and the Hulkaminam, they guided the direction of this project in terms of shaping research questions. So, Heichka, thank you. I think we have time for questions.
There are 42 people online.
Hello, 42 people online.
So you could invite them to put their questions in the chat. And I'll
Okay. So 42 people online, you're invited to put your questions in the chat and they will be read out to me. There's a question all the way in the back.
And also, if you could repeat the question for the online.
Yeah. So for the online people, her question was about an octopus garden that she was showing up in Haida Gwaii that was smaller than clam gardens. And she asked me if I had any knowledge about it. I don't specifically, more than there is a resource online. I think it was created by students at SFU, maybe in collaboration with, I can't remember, but it's a story map that goes into detail about clam gardens and other similar practices across the world. So it's interesting. There are similar practices really everywhere across the globe. And I have heard of octopus gardens. I don't know much about them. It's interesting in clam gardens or sea gardens that clams, as I mentioned, yes, clams are the resource that we're looking at, but there's also mentions of catching salmon in the kind of bay that's created by the rock wall or things like that, that I think is very interesting, the sort of other side effects. Yeah, opportunities. I like that word a lot better. Thank you. Do we have any online questions?
We do not have any online questions yet.
Question.
Since these clam gardens are like very old practices, so I don't know if you know about any old practice of checking the health of plants, not necessarily with like new techniques or
So the question was understanding that this is an old practice, practices that were developed thousands of years ago. Are there any more traditional techniques of assessing clam health than modern, laboratory-based methods? What I've heard, there's a sort of saying that goes around, which it goes, you don't harvest shellfish in months that have an R in them, sorry, I said that the wrong way around. You don't harvest shellfish with months that don't have an R. So like the summer months, which have more likelihood of phytoplankton blooms because of the heat, and then the beginning spring high nutrient levels, that's kind of what's usually avoided. So like May, June, July, August. There was another one about, someone said, if you see like the birds eating the clams and the birds are surviving, or like some other, it's some other wildlife eating the clams, then they're probably safe. And it's also interesting though to think about this all in context of, with climate change, we are seeing more harmful algal blooms. And so thousands of years ago, would we have been in the same situation? There probably would have been less chance of shellfish poisoning.
We got two questions from the online. I'll give you there's three here now, but I'll give you the easy one first. Is the last image that says Russell Reef on Saturna Island? Is Russell Reef a clam garden?
I don't know the name of the clam gardens, like the locations. I just have images of them, of where we visited. I think so, but I couldn't, like the name Russell Island sounds, is it?
Russell Reef
on Saturna Island? I don't know.
The other question is there a move to establish a comprehensive network of foreshore leases for sea gardens?
So the foreshore lease question is a bit of a complex issue. So in the US, there is you can own land in the kind of beach area, so it's a different issue than in BC. In the States, I know there's nations that have, or tribes that have asserted rights to the beach area. So even though it's a landowner is like a private landowner's land, the nations have the right to cross it, and there's agreements there that are written. In BC, the foreshore, with the leasing of the foreshore is where it gets complicated, and you know, it's definitely an interesting time right now, and moving forward, how we're gonna progress with reconciliation in this space. So I don't know if I have an answer to that, but it is complicated.
A couple more questions here, but are there any others from the room? Okay. So the next question here is from Stephen, who says, you've done a great job of analyzing and framing the existing situation. What could we as Nature Vancouver do to assist you in this initiative?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Stephen. What I would say of a starting place is kind of a continual learning, so that you can have the tools and the understanding when you are coming across situations, and you can best support the First Nations that are doing work of restoration or reconciliation. So, you know, there's so many resources online in the reconciliation space and the Indigenous rights space, being educated about that world and where we're moving, because we are progressing. That's definitely a place to start if you're not literate in that world. And then having that understanding when you're, I heard you do field trips, you know, if you're going out to a beach or something, it's nice to know and worth taking the time to know whose territory you're visiting, and maybe if there are any initiatives that you as a community can get involved in by volunteering or like.
In coastal BC, how many clam gardens are active and how many are closed at this time?
That's interesting. So how many clam gardens? I think I wouldn't, was the question about how many clam gardens or how many harvest sites? Because clam gardens aren't really open or closed. They're more, maybe the question was about whether they're being actively restored or not. I think the clam gardens that are being restored in the Sea Gardens Restoration Project, those are actually the pioneering restoration work in the province. So back in 2014, I could have said like just 2. Now, though, there are other nations that are doing this work, learning from what this project's learned. And in the States, there's tribes as well doing restoration work. But if the question was more about what harvest sites are open or closed, there's so many. There is a federal resource that will show you them all. You can find it online.
What do you think the next step should be to mobilize the knowledge you've gathered through your research to address this complex problem of revitalizing shellfish harvest and Indigenous food sovereignty? Who do you think needs to know about this?
Who do I think needs to know? Well, I think there's definitely sway, like, in the Canadian Food Inspection Agency implementing the Canadian Shellfish Sanitation Program. If we're working on getting messages to them And as I said, one of the levers identified was about leveraging these government departments' mandates for reconciliation. So, yeah, if we can find a way to craft a message that, a message that makes the argument for why there needs to be funding and capacity developed to have these Indigenous-led monitoring programs, then I think, yeah, those departments in the government responsible for implementing the CSSP are a great place to start, DFO as well. And I think one of the key pieces of the message I'm sharing is to sort of highlight the work that's already being done. You know, I ended the talk with the Watch Project. That is an exciting project. First Nations Health Authority is an Indigenous-led or group. And so some of the work they're doing could use long-term funding, could use more capacity, and to be able to expand their work across the coast. I'd love to see that.
What attention is being paid to poaching and enforcement of harvest regulations?
Poaching and enforcement of harvest regulations. Yeah, I'm not too sure. That's a little bit outside of the scope of my work. It's more focused on how can we, you know, support harvesting where it's safe to do so. Clams are not in any way, shape, or form endangered. So it's a little bit different of an issue here.
I had a question about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
What's the Indigenous practices from other defensive buyouts?
The question for online folk was about what are the Indigenous consumption practices about other shellfish than clams? Definitely, I'm sure they're consumed. Clams specifically have a cultural significance and association with clam gardens. So, yeah, what was the reasoning for that? Like, what are you interested in knowing?
I was thinking that our big oysters are
Introduced species.
Big native one, the endemic one is smaller.
I had a question about the other things they do to modify the beaches or clam gardens. You mentioned a couple of things besides just building walls. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, the question was to elaborate on some of the other practices in clam gardens beyond building a rock wall. So I mentioned tilling, which is something, it's kind of like raking the sand, and you're trying to aerate the sand so that clams have a better chance of survival, get more oxygen. So that takes a long time, and you know we've spent multiple hours raking beaches from one side to the other. It's quite a common practice too. Another one that I mentioned is about spreading shell hash. And so shell hash is like ground up shells, like shells from clams, and you spread them in the clam garden because the calcium carbonate in the shells helps with the buffering of the ocean. It means that the clams that are growing new shells in the clam garden have more carbonate to build their clams with. So that's and actually also there's studies in more recent times, like over the past few years, looking at that buffering effect and climate change, ocean acidification. So that's really interesting work, kind of exploring the benefits that clam gardens have in buffering ocean acidification on the local scale, and also buffering temperature rises as well, because the beaches hold water longer because they're usually less steep. Yeah, interesting perspectives there. And then so I talked about shell hash, tilling, and building a rock wall, and then the removal of predators. So it's pretty simple, like taking away, if you're just like you're on the clam garden and you see a predator, you can remove it, and that increases the survival rate of the clams. Which predators? Sea stars, definitely. Octopuses. Yeah, they might. And then the other one was about transplanting baby clams. So if there's like a specific beach that is thriving really well and you're trying to restore another beach, transplanting some of those baby clams into another beach can kind of help that community thrive. Yeah.
You're saying that the ocean gardens will have more than clams. Clams, of course, is the main focus in terms of the history of culture. But what would the secondary be? Would it be like sea urchins or sea cucumbers, or what are the other important foods that they would get from the sea gardens?
So the question for online folks was, what are the other species that are there as food sources besides clams and clam gardens, important to Indigenous people? Sea urchins for sure. You mentioned sea cucumbers, seaweeds. Those are all food sources. Yeah, red rock crabs, I think I mentioned too. Yeah. How does one transplant a baby clam is the question. Yeah, you know, when we're going out to the beaches, you've got, I guess in modern days, we have like shovels and tilling equipment that you'd use in your garden, your usual garden. So you dig them up, you find them, and then you bury them or just place them on the surface and they'll dig themselves. But traditionally, I think they had, you know, just sticks, like they didn't have shovels, so do the same thing. Yeah.
There was one more question here from Peter Balen. What involvement do you have with the developing coastal marine strategy?
Thank you, Peter. The question, or that was an online question, so you guys heard or were able to read it. Me particularly, I don't have any involvement. I am a little bit aware of the work that they're doing, not too aware though. There's a question. So the question was about what resources are there for connecting to Indigenous culture and learning about it. I think the starting place is probably to understand UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. Those are, very foundational pieces. where would I go from there? I think if you're interested in like a specific issue or a specific geographical area, nation websites or band websites are great places to find out what like your local nations are up to, and what their priorities are. And then definitely like the BC Assembly of First Nations, or in Canada, the Assembly of First Nations. I also have a bunch of resources on clam gardens that you can peruse. Yeah.
Were any of Vancouver's beaches originally sea gardens?
In Vancouver, yes. Yeah, in Stanley Park. I've not like been to any that a knowledge keeper has told me this is a clam garden, but I'm sure there were care practices for many of the beaches that are around Vancouver, and up into Indian Arm as well. Yeah. New Brighton Park was mentioned by people in the room. Thank you.
If there is any agreement, let's say, for example, you don't know about baby clams, or whether there's or this area, we don't explore the use of doing this part of the year, or these areas, this community and this quality. How is there any
So I think the question was about, are there any like conservation practices as agreements in the use of resources?
More like years and years and years.
Yes, definitely. There are traditional conservation practices is really what they are, to harvest in a way that reflects sustainability for future generations. I've got this slide up already, and number 2 on that list is a very thorough report of the restoration work in the project, and there's sections in there about what those conservation practices were or are, like definitely harvesting size no smaller than, I don't know off the top of my head, but that was one for sure. Yeah. The question was about whether clams have had any disease kind of similar to sea star wasting. Not that I know of similar to sea star wasting, but you're right, with the heat, we've had like mass shellfish mortality events, especially in the summer where the low tides are during the middle of the day. So they're spending such long periods of time in direct heat, that over the past few years, there have been some mass mortality events.